I said at the top of the show that this week's episode is also doubling as the annual Sound Off prediction show where I look back at what I got right and what I got very wrong in 2020, and I gaze into my crystal ball to see what lies ahead in the world of wrestling in 2021. 2020 was a year like no other. I think it's safe to say it gave us the first ever empty arena WrestleMania. Money in the Bank inside and on top of Titan Tower. It gave us the Thunderdome. It gave us some great things like heel Roman Reigns and the Hurt Business. And not so great things like Retribution and Raw Underground. Goldberg beating The Fiend. Rey Mysterio's fake eyeball. I can go on and on. I was going to say gumball, but that's basically what it was. The list of horrible things is far longer, unfortunately. I don't think anybody could have predicted any of those things. So when I or anybody else did their predictions for 2020, I don't think, well, maybe Goldberg beating The Fiend, but I don't think any of these things would have been on their list. Shout out to Byron from upstate New York for helping track my predictions from last year. These are from Sound Off episode 634. If you want to go back and listen to them all over again. Let me run through what I got right and what I got wrong, because unlike other people, I do hold myself accountable for these things. I could just ignore it like it didn't happen and just move on, but figure let's see what I got right and what I got wrong. I predicted that Drew McIntyre would win the Elimination Chamber and go on to beat Brock Lesnar for the WWE title at WrestleMania. So I was half right. I predicted that Roman Reigns would win the Men's Royal Rumble and face The Fiend, Bray Wyatt, for the Universal title at WrestleMania, which definitely did not happen. I predicted that Ronda Rousey would return to win the Women's Royal Rumble match, face Becky Lynch for the Raw Women's title at WrestleMania, and lose. And then Shayna Baszler would attack Becky on Raw the next night, start a program with her, and go on to end the year-long reign of Becky Lynch. It could have gone down that way with Shayna Baszler, but it did not. Nor could I have predicted that Becky would be going away because she would be pregnant, but none of that happened. I predicted that Edge would be a surprise entrant in the Royal Rumble, so that one was right. I predicted John Cena would wrestle the Velveteen Dream at WrestleMania, which maybe in hindsight was a good idea that it didn't happen. But Cena had talked the Dream up a lot on interviews, or some panel maybe it was. He had talked him up before as being somebody that he would love to wrestle, who he saw a big future in. And that would have been a great spot for them to make a new star in one night, in one program, if they wanted to. For all the talk about CM Punk possibly coming back at that, and there was a lot of talk at that time about Punk. You know, AEW Dynamite had just debuted on TNT. I predicted that Punk would not wrestle in 2020, which he did not. Nor should he. If he has plans to come back, you cannot have CM Punk come back and wrestle and make his big return unless you have fuller crowds. Maybe not a full crowd, but fuller crowds back in the build. CM Punk is not going to come back to the fucking Thunderdome screens. CM Punk should not be coming back in front of 750 or 1,000 people at Daly's place. If he's going to come back, then you need to have a full building, make it a surprise, and then boom, out he walks. And he gets either big cheers or big boos. Otherwise, it makes no sense for him to come back right now until they get people back in the buildings. I predicted that The Undertaker would wrestle his final match at Survivor Series, which would be his send-off, 30th anniversary. And he would then headline the Hall of Fame class in 2021. I was sort of right, but not really. He did have his big send-off at the Survivor Series, but it was not in a match. I do think were it not for COVID, though, the Hall of Fame this year probably would have been built around The Undertaker. Instead, they're probably just going to rerun last year's Hall of Fame class because they never got proper inductions. I predicted the WWE would host its first ever Queen of the Ring event, which did not happen, but I still think it should. I predicted that Jon Moxley would beat Chris Jericho to become the new AEW champion at Revolution, and then would drop the title to Kenny Omega at All Out. I was mostly right on this. He did beat Jericho at Revolution. He did drop the title to Kenny Omega later in the year, but it was a few months later on Dynamite. That I would not have predicted. I would not have predicted the title change would happen on free TV. I predicted that Matt Hardy would leave WWE, which he did, on March 1st. I said he would leave for AEW to be revealed as the Exalted One of the Dark Order. AEW went with Brody Lee instead. They do admit that Hardy was under consideration, though, for that role, but they went with Brody instead. I predicted that Marty Scurll would not sign with AEW, but instead would re-sign with Ring of Honor and would be allowed to continue to work with the NWA, which is exactly what happened. And now he is not with either one of those companies. 2020 giveth, 2020 taketh away. I predicted that the Revival would re-sign with WWE, which did not happen. I'm sure they're very happy about that. I predicted that Brody Lee would sign with AEW, which he did. I predicted that Undisputed Era would head to the main roster. Boy, I was happy to be wrong on that one. I predicted that Bianca Belair would be women's champion, but not in NXT. She would either be the champion on Raw or SmackDown. Now, she did get called up. She did not win either title, though. Not yet. But she is well on her way. I predicted that Austin Theory would be the NXT North American champion by the end of the summer. He is aligned right now with the North American champion, but not the champion himself. I predicted 205 Live would end, and yet it lives on for some reason. I predicted that NWA Power would find a way, or would find a home on the WWE Network by year's end. I still think there was a decent chance of that happening. There were discussions at one point with, I think, Corgan, Lagana, and WWE. I think the pandemic and I think the Dave Lagana stuff just killed any chance of that happening. But I maintain that there was a pretty decent chance of that happening before the end of last year. I predicted that MLW would land on a name network and would sign Killer Cross. And that Cross would also work dates for New Japan. This was after MLW had signed Jacob Fatu to a new 5-year deal. And I had been told, and I was told this, that they were going to be getting aggressive with more signings. And Cross was kind of either a free agent or he had been trying to get his release from Impact. And he ended up signing with WWE instead. And finally, with the New Japan predictions here, I predicted that Sonata would win the New Japan Cup. And the Cup got delayed due to COVID. And then he lost to Evil in the semifinals. But would then fall short of winning the IWGP Championship, but would become the Intercontinental Champion by the end of the year. And he did not win either one of those. And I predicted that Kota Ibushi would win the IWGP title from Tetsuya Naito. I was only off by a few days, guys. I was only off by 4 days. You got to cut me some slack on that one. My other prediction was that Okada would pin Will Ospreay in the finals of the G1, and Okada would go on to challenge Ibushi for the belt in a kind of a role reversal from night one of Wrestle Kingdom the previous year. But this time he would lose. Okada would lose. We did get to see Ibushi beat Naito and Okada beat Ospreay. Just happened on the same night in the first week of 2021. So what is that? 7 out of 22, I think? I've had better years. Let's see if we can rebound in 2021. Here are my predictions for 2021. The lows keep getting lower every year. From Monday Night Raw, you hear me say it every year. The lows keep getting lower. And this year will be no different. I predict that Raw will see its lowest ratings ever, bottoming out at 1.3 million viewers. I think that's their base, that they will just simply not dip below, at least not this year. And it won't be for any long stretch of time, but things are going to get bad again at some point, and I believe that 1.3 is going to be the low point that they hit this year. I predict that Daniel Bryan will win the Men's Royal Rumble match, but will fall short in his quest to become Universal Champion against Roman Reigns at WrestleMania. As far as the Women's Royal Rumble is concerned, you've heard me talk about Bianca Belair, how I think she should go on to win and then challenge Sasha Banks at WrestleMania. But these are predictions though, and not hopes. That's what I hope happens. That's what I'm kind of leaning towards happening, but I have a different idea in mind as far as what I actually predict is going to happen, and it's what I was just talking about a few minutes ago. I predict that Rhea Ripley will debut on the Raw brand, and she will win the Women's Royal Rumble match while Charlotte Flair takes the Raw Women's title from Asuka, either at the Rumble or the Elimination Chamber pay-per-view. That paved the way for Rhea to challenge Charlotte in a rematch from last year's WrestleMania, where she lost. This time, they make it to Raymond James Stadium. If Raymond James Stadium is going to be where they host WrestleMania this year, and we don't know that yet. It's not official. But I think they'll make it back there, and this time Ripley avenges that loss, and she wins the championship from Charlotte Flair. I predict that Edge will wrestle AJ Styles at SummerSlam. I'll just be happy for it to be someone other than Randy Orton. And by the time they get to the match, I'll make another prediction. AJ will no longer have a bodyguard. Omos will be Nomos. I predict that Ricochet, if he knows what's good for him, will be the next WWE name to leave for AEW. And look, I don't know when the contract for Aleister Black is up. If it is this year, then he's as good as gone too. And that probably isn't a very bold prediction considering A, what they've done with him, and B, what happened with his wife. But if his contract is up this year, he's got to get the hell out of there. And I think he will. The sooner the better. It is an absolute disgrace what that company has done with him, or the lack of what they have done with him. It is an absolute disgrace. And they do not deserve to have him on that roster. I predict that USA Network will move NXT off of Wednesday nights, where it is dying a death most weeks against AEW. NXT could easily be pulling in 150 to 200,000 more viewers each week and getting those demos up, which the so important demos, if they just switch nights, if they just move to a different night. Vince McMahon may not want to make the move because he doesn't want AEW to run unopposed. And if you don't think so, then you're a fool. But he's not going to have final say, and I predict that USA will get NXT moved to Thursday nights at some point this year. Now, some of this is obviously predicated on the world climbing out of the pandemic enough. We're not going to be totally out of it, but if we can climb out of the pandemic enough to at least relax some of the travel restrictions, I do believe at some point this year that AEW and New Japan Pro Wrestling will work together. The forbidden portal shall be opened. I predict that Kenny Omega will wrestle and defeat Jon Moxley in a rematch at Revolution next month. And while the working relationship is going to continue between AEW and Impact Wrestling, Omega will not win the Impact World title from Rich Swann, but he will win the NWA World's Heavyweight Championship, I believe, from Nick Aldis to add to his collection. I also don't think that the NWA is going to survive the year. And it pains me to say that, but it's just the feeling I have. Every few weeks it feels like it brings news of another departure. The most recent one was now the referees are leaving, or not being renewed. Referee Brian Hebner no longer under contract to the NWA. We've heard of Zicky Dice and Marty Bell, among other names that are no longer there. They have no major shows. I know they have their new Shockwave show, but there's no return of Power being talked about, big pay-per-views or anything. No major shows on the horizon due to the pandemic. I just don't think it looks good at all for the NWA. I predict that Adam Hangman Page will win the AEW World Championship from Kenny Omega at Full Gear in November. The same event where he lost last year to Omega in the World Title Eliminator. and will become the first man in AEW. I know some people have kicked out of it before in Japan, but he will become the first man in AEW to kick out of the one-winged angel. I predict Sting will wrestle a total of 3 cinematic matches in 2021, teaming with Darby Allin against Team Taz, a singles match with Chris Jericho, and a singles match with Cody Rhodes. I predict that Britt Baker will be your next AEW Women's Champion, and Thunder Rosa, who will end up working for AEW full-time when the NWA pretty much is either done or almost done. Thunder Rosa will be the one to take that title from Britt Baker. I predict that Penta and Rey Fenix will hold AEW Gold in 2021, but it will be in the form of Trios Gold as part of Death Triangle with PAC after AEW introduces Trios Tag Team titles. I predict that Jungle Boy, now with his old Tarzan Boy theme song that Tony Khan just bought the rights to, will have a breakout year as a single star, and he will become the TNT champion. And when they get big crowds back in the buildings again, which I don't think will be until 2022, I'm sorry, but that's what I think. But when that happens, his entrance is going to turn him into an even bigger star. You know, someone mentioned to me Grado's old entrance when he would come out, like in ICW, he'd come out to Like a Prayer by Madonna. Picture an entrance like that here in this country, but in front of 5,000 or 10,000 people. But again, the crowds, I think we're looking at next year. I mean, they've got some crowds now. They had more people than ever, I think, in the building for the Brody Lee tribute show. They had about 1,000 or a little over 1,000. And that's, I think, the biggest they've done. But, you know, when I talk about crowds, I'm talking crowds like we had before. And I just don't see that happening this year. It's going to be some time, unfortunately, before we get back to that. I predict that Miro, once this best man stuff has run its course, will take the TNT title. And the only question is, does he take it from Darby Allin? Or does he take it from Jungle Boy, if my other prediction is right? I predict that Wardlow will also be one of the breakout stars in AEW this year once he splits away from MJF as a babyface. I also think before the year is over that Sammy Guevara will end up as a babyface. Sammy Guevara has a babyface, so at some point he has to end up as a babyface. It only makes sense. The guy looks like he's, 16 years old. I predict that AEW will finally do a blood and guts match before the end of the year. I predict that AEW's second show will finally premiere on Saturdays at 6:05 p.m. The old WCW Saturday night slot, the mothership, as Dusty Rhodes used to say, either on TNT or TBS. I mean, they're both in the same family, so either one would... TBS would make more sense for nostalgia's sake. But, I mean, you got Dynamite airing midweek, right? Dynamite airs right in the middle of the week on Wednesdays. Saturday is probably the likeliest time for a second show. Either way, I mean, if you wanted to put some space between the two, and if Dark stays on Tuesdays on YouTube only, I would think Saturdays probably would make the most sense. I predict that Jay White will stay with New Japan Pro Wrestling and will be the man to take the IWGP United States Championship away from Jon Moxley. It'll be White that does it, not Kenta. White then makes a run to win the G1 Climax, making it all the way to the finals before ultimately losing to Okada. And I predict that Kota Ibushi will remain IWGP champion for the remainder of the year into the beginning of 2022. And Will Ospreay will become Intercontinental Champion once they end this double champion stuff and they separate, not unify, the two titles. And he does so by beating Ibushi. Ibushi said the other day in that presser after his Wrestle Kingdom main event on night 2, he said he doesn't mind defending each title separately. He wants to unify them, But if New Japan wants him to defend them separately, then he says he has no problem doing that. So, how's this for a prediction? Ibushi loses the IC title to Ospreay. Okada wins the G1, then beats Ibushi to win back the IWGP title at Wrestle Kingdom 16, which then sets up Will Ospreay to challenge Okada with the idea that Ospreay pinned the IWGP champion, but never won the top title because that title isn't the one that was on the line. And now, if he wants to be the champion, he's got to beat Okada to do it, and Okada is the same man who just beat him at Wrestle Kingdom. Now there's some long-term storytelling, which New Japan usually is very good with. But I guess some of those predictions bleed into 2022. But anyway, that is my look at what I see happening in 2021. You guys let me know what you agree with and disagree with, and I want to know your predictions. What do you think is going to happen? What do you think is going to happen in the world of wrestling? Bold predictions for 2021. Let me know.